they die. And one drops into each glass of beer. The American looks at the glass of beer with a fly, pushes it away, orders another glass of beer. The Australian puts his finger in the beer, picks out the fly, and drinks the beer. The New Zealander puts his finger in the beer, takes out the fly, throws away the beer, and eats the fly. Now, the reason I tell you this story is because each person thought they were doing the best thing. They were working out what was best. So today, what I want to talk about is what I think is best for foreign language teaching. And it's very much my opinion. The reason I chose this as a topic is because over the last 6 months or so, I wrote a couple of books. And these are not like any other books that I've written before. Most of the books that I write, I have to spend a lot of time reading, looking at research and trying to analyze the research. But I've seen some manuscripts of books which were written for teachers who had no previous training in EFL. And when I looked at them, I thought there are many, many things which I think are important, which are missing from these books. And so what I thought was, I've been training teachers of English and teaching English for almost 50 years. And if I don't know what's important now, I will never know. So I thought I'll try and write what I think is really important. So when I wrote the books, I didn't look at research, but I used my memory of the research that I've read to do the writing. The interesting thing was that when I'd written the book for EFL teachers, I thought, well, this isn't fair because I live in New Zealand and most of the teachers who are my colleagues in New Zealand are teachers of ESL. And I thought, well, I should write an ESL book for them. And I thought it would be quite simple. All I would do would be to take some chapters of the EFL book, put them into the ESL book, and fill in a few gaps. But it didn't work that way. It was quite different. I had to write a completely new book. And about half of the book for the ESL teachers was about needs analysis and finding out what the needs of your learners are. Because in an ESL situation, that's even more important than it is in an EFL situation. The good news, folks, is the ESL book is free. If you want it, the web address is here. You can download it for free. It's an electronic book, and it's not, you don't have to pay for it or anything like that. Okay, so today I want to look at what I think are the most important teaching techniques, what I think are the most important changes that a teacher could make to an EFL course. And I also want to try and explain why these are the most important techniques and the most important changes by looking at what I think are the most important principles for language teaching. So it's a which is the best 3/4 of an hour, folks. So the first thing, which are the 20 best foreign language teaching techniques? If you look at table 1 on your handout, there is a list of 20. Don't count them in case there are only 19 or in case there are 21. But there are supposed to be 20. And these are what I think are the best EFL techniques. You can still teach a good course without using some of these techniques and by replacing them with other techniques. But it's really important that if you do that, you follow the important principle of having a good balance of opportunities for learning in a course. And we'll come to that in a little while. So let's look very quickly at what I think are the 20 best techniques. If you don't know some of them, or if my explanation is not clear, don't worry. The ESL book and the EFL books have very full explanations of them. The first one is listening to stories. This is a listening activity where the teacher simply sits down and reads a story to the learners. Even if the learners are quite advanced learners, you do it by choosing a book which is appropriate for their level. And after reading for a few minutes, noting a few words on the board, the teacher says, "To be continued." Closes the book, and then the next class or a couple of classes later, the story continues. So a very easy activity for the teacher to use, but one which is very important for providing listening input for foreign language learners. The second one for listening is read and listen. And I put controlled listening in brackets here. One of the most exciting things for me are the new digital tape recorders. Those digital tape recorders, if you want to, you can play back at a slower speed or a faster speed, and it still sounds okay. Now this seems to me tremendous for developing listening skills, because now people can listen at the speed which is the best speed for them, and then they can try to increase the speed. I'm looking forward to research coming out on the effect of changing the speed and re-listening and so on using these digital tape recorders. I think they're a marvelous invention. If someone said, "Oh, I have trouble with listening, everybody speaks too fast, what should I do?" Well, the answer has been, well, listen quickly. But now, such an answer is a sensible answer, because now you can listen quickly or you can listen slowly. So I think this is great. Do you want to listen quickly now, or do you want to listen slowly? Okay, slowly. Okay, good. Dictation is another listening activity. This is a very old activity. I'm sure it's thousands of years old. But because something is old, that means we must respect it. And that applies to teaching techniques, theory learning, and teachers. Okay, speaking, paired conversation, where learners talk to each other. It's really important that courses, balanced language courses, contain opportunities for learners to speak to each other in meaningful communicative situations. Prepared talks is when learners prepare talks and then have to deliver them. And so this allows them to perform at a slightly higher level by having a chance to prepare and practice before doing it. Problem-solving speaking is a little bit like paired conversation, but these are activities where the learners work together to solve problems through speaking and through listening. And then we have two activities, same or different or identified, which are simply listening activities for pronunciation practice. They are to enable learners to hear the difference between important sounds, to distinguish them, and then to be able to use them in their production. And then the last one for speaking I've got here is the 4-3-2 activity for repeated speaking. It's a fluency development activity with talk on the topic for 4 minutes, then they change partners, and they, I'm just checking my heart. I'm not quite sure if I'm still living or not. So if my voice cuts out, it could be the microphone or me. So. And I don't have any technical skills, so I have to check me first. Okay. 4-3-2. And then 2 minutes with a new partner, and so they give the same talk 3 times. There's now more research appearing on this. There's a very interesting piece of research in one of the latest issues of the journal Language Learning, looking at this activity and its effect on fluency development. When we come to reading, then we have extensive reading, and I'm going to come back to that in a few minutes. Extensive reading, where learners read a lot, and they read material which is relatively easy for them. But the important thing is large quantities of reading. Then we have paired reading, where learners work together and help each other with reading. And then intensive reading. One kind of intensive reading is grammar translation. I'm quite happy with grammar translation. The first language is a reasonable way to explain things, grammar points and vocabulary which are difficult for learners. But it's important that it doesn't take over the whole course. So intensive reading, and if it's applied as grammar translation, that's okay, but it should only be a very small part of the course. If you want to get some rough idea of the proportion of the course, on the back of your handout, I've tried to distribute the teaching techniques across a table which shows the relative proportion of course for each of the techniques and activities. Speed reading. It's important that learners have the opportunity to become fluent in reading, and speed reading courses are very effective. They are sometimes probably better called timed reading, where learners read simple passages at various speeds. There are books available which put these speed reading courses into practice, and you can also download free speed reading courses. We come to writing with feedback. That's where the learners write and the teacher gives them feedback on their writing. This is very hard for foreign language teachers because giving correction of someone's written work is very time consuming, but it's also very difficult to make judgments about what's right and what's wrong. I guess my advice for that would simply be only mark what's wrong if you're 100% sure it's wrong. Otherwise, leave it. And then information transfer is another kind of writing activity where learners work from tables of information to produce writing. And then we have another very old technique, substitution tables. Respect its age, folks. But substitution tables are a very good way of dealing with grammar points and a very good way of giving attention to grammatical features in a way which also provides very useful sentences. And then 10-minute writing. We're just seeing the beginning of research on 10-minute writing. This is where learners write for 10 minutes on any topic they like. The teacher doesn't mark the word. It's very important in fluency activities that the learners are not corrected for grammar or pronunciation or anything like that. Fluency activities are simply to get fast production, and it's important that the teacher doesn't respond to the accuracy of the word. If you start marking or looking at the grammar and pronunciation, spelling or whatever of fluency activities, you slow the learners down. And then general purpose activities. So Richmond and I are in complete agreement here. Yesterday? Was it yesterday or last month? Okay, yesterday. Yesterday he talked about integrated skills activities where you read about something and then you speak about it and so on. These are perfect for vocabulary learning. Linked skills activities where the learners work on exactly the same material through 3 different skills of listening, speaking, reading or writing are very, very effective for vocabulary learning. They set up ideal conditions for repetition, retrieval, varied use, and are really very good for vocab learning and language learning. And then we have issue logs. Issue logs are where learners choose a topic which is of interest to them, and over the period of a few weeks, they gather as much information as they can about that topic, from the web, from newspapers, from all sorts of places, and they report back to a small group of people about every 2 weeks about the information they've collected. And then towards the end of the course, they have to present a written paper and also present a talk on their topic. So this gets them working in a very narrow focused area, and having a narrow focus like this reduces the amount of different vocabulary that they meet, and this is a good thing, and gets much more repetition of that vocabulary as they keep following the same topic and learning more about that topic. It also allows them to bring lots of background knowledge to what they do as they build up that knowledge. So a very useful activity, and it can be adapted to all levels. And then the last one is word cards, deliberate learning from word cards. I'm a great fan of memorization. I think memorization is really important. And deliberate learning from word cards is a very effective way of increasing vocabulary. There's now research which shows that the learning from word cards directly results in what's called implicit knowledge. and that is subconscious knowledge. So Steve Krashen's wrong as far as vocabulary is concerned. Deliberate learning does result in implicit knowledge. The article is in the journal Language Learning, 2010 by Irina Elcott, and for me it's probably the most important, how to say, theoretical finding in vocabulary studies in the last 20 years or so. It's very convincing direct evidence that deliberate learning results in the subconscious knowledge that is needed for normal language use. So the learning acquisition distinction is irrelevant for vocabulary. So they are the main techniques. So these are what I think are the 20 top activities. And one of the reasons why they are the 20 top activities is that they spread across the strands, which are in column 3 of table 1. In table 1 we have the strands of input, of output, of deliberate learning, language-focused learning, and fluency development. And these 20 activities provide a balance across these 4 very important opportunities for learning. So, that's the end of the first part. I reckon I deserve a drink. Okay. Would someone like to come and chase the flies away? Well, I have. Good. Okay. So that's teaching activities. Which is the best of the best? If you had to choose one teaching activity to be the top of the pops, which one would you choose? Now everybody will have different ideas. I think for me, the best one is probably the linked skills activity. So Richmond and I are brothers on this one. That is where learners work through the same material across 3 different skills of listening, speaking, reading or writing. These activities are set up such ideal conditions for learning that I think they are really important in any teaching program. In the ESL book, the free one, there's a whole chapter about linked skills activities. It's about 10 or 12 pages, giving you lots of examples and everything like that. It's free, folks. The price is right. So go get it. Okay. Now, the next thing I want to look at is, if you have a teaching program, you're teaching, and you've decided, I've been to CamTESOL, I've met lots of strange and new ideas, and some old ideas, and so on. I want to make a change to my course when I go back. So that if I make a change, maybe my school will say, oh, that was good, we'll send them again to CamTESOL next year. What change would be the most important change that you could make? Now, there is no question in my mind about this. It's my opinion, I suppose, but the research supports it very strongly. The most important addition or change that a teacher could make to an EFL program is to have a well thought out, extensive reading program. That would be number 1. And the reason why it's number 1 is because this provides large opportunities of input in the foreign language for the learners. About 3 weeks ago, I'm in Japan for for 4 months, and I'm halfway through my time there. But I'd heard about a teacher who runs an after-hours school for students. So they go to school in the day and their parents are worried about their education, so they pay a lot of money to send them to a private study school in the evening. These students go to this private study school for 3 hours once a week. Now this person spends 80 minutes of those 3 hours getting the students to do extensive reading. So that means they sit quietly, each student reading a different book for 80 minutes. The teacher doesn't do anything, the teacher just sits at the front. Now the parents are paying a lot of money for this. I asked them, how much does it cost? It's a lot of money. I couldn't afford it. And they're sitting there for half of that 3 hours doing extensive reading. And this guy who owns the language school is making a fortune. And I went there and they said, oh yeah, this building here, some classes are in there Mr. Furukawa, he owns that building. So the guy who runs the language school owns this building in central Tokyo, where he has these language schools where people spend half their time where the teacher does nothing, but the learners sit quietly and read for 80 minutes. For the other 80 minutes, the teacher activity, led with speaking and all that sort of stuff. But the reason he makes his money is on the tests that these students have to sit, which have nothing to do with the school. These students get really top marks in reading and in speaking and listening. They don't do so well in grammar, but they do really well in the reading and speaking and listening parts of these tests. So the parents are very happy to take the money. But this is just a commercial example. There is lots of research to show that extensive reading results in all kinds of different language development. And so I think the most important change that a teacher could make to a course would be, don't teach so much and use that time for getting the learners to do extensive reading. The big problem is extensive reading books cost money. And if Cambodia isn't a rich country yet, not long, you'll be rich soon, don't you worry. Well, actually, maybe you should worry, because sometimes when you're rich it isn't quite so good, but maybe it's good to be rich and not quite so good. What I'm trying to do is, on my website, I'm going to try and make a cemetery or a graveyard for extensive readers. All the extensive readers which are no longer in print because they're no good, I want to get people to give them to me because they're not in copyright anymore, put them on my website so people can download them for free. There are 2 there already, free. They're the ones that I wrote, and they're no good. But the idea then is to collect these and so that learners can read them. For advanced learners, there's another part of my website which provides reading material for extensive reading for advanced learners. At the moment we have about 7 or 8 different books there at the 4,000, 6,000 and 8,000 word level, and they're all free. Everything on my website is free. I've got no money in my pocket. I'm free. And our plan is at 50 books there. So at the moment we've got about 7 or 8, and people, volunteers, are adapting these books. They're out of copyright, and the idea is we try to get 50, because once we have 50, that's enough for a very good extensive reading program for advanced learners. So have a look, folks. But that's the number 1 change, I think, which would be most important. So I would say to you, if you don't know what extensive reading is, go on the web and find out. There are plenty of free books which explain extensive reading. Okay. And get those free books which explain extensive reading, and then work at setting up an extensive reading program. It is the best change that you could ever make to your program. The most famous piece of research on extensive reading is the book flood study by Eli and Mangabai, done in Fiji in the 1980s. What Eli and Mangabai did was, they went into the schools in Fiji, in the countryside. And the people in the countryside are very poor. They're people who cut the sugar cane, for the sugar plantations in Fiji and so on. And they only study English for 4 classes a week. And so what Eli and Mangabai did was to replace 3 of these 4 classes with extensive reading. And then they compared them with other students in the same schools who just carried on with the normal program with the teacher up the front teaching. In 8 months, the classes with doing the extensive reading had made 15 months progress compared to the people who continued with the normal program. They went back a year later and tested the same students again, and a year later those students were still about 7 months ahead of the other students. The students who were doing the extensive reading were not doing more work. They were still only doing the reading in those during the week. So there were still only 4 classes. It wasn't anything added. They just replaced 3 of the 4 classes with extensive reading. And so you had these very striking changes. And that piece of research is well worth reading. It's only about 16 pages long, very clearly written. Elliot Munderwide and PG Book Club. Have a look, folks. It's a very important piece of research. The second change, if you were so excited about the first change and the success of having a good extensive reading program on your learners' English proficiency, the second change would be a fluency development program. And a fluency development program would use the activities in Table 1, which have fluency development next to them in column 3. So these would be activities like 432 for repeated speaking, speed reading, 10-minute writing. They are the fluency development activities. And these don't take very much time. You only need to do them a few minutes a week, but they have very interesting effects. They not only improve fluency, but they develop proficiency in other parts of the language skill. And then we have 3, 4, 5, but I don't want to talk about that. It's getting boring for me talking about that. I want to entertain myself. Let's move on to the teacher's jobs. So far we've looked at what's the most important teaching techniques that teachers should have in a course. And then we've tried to look at what I think is the most important improvement or change that a teacher can make to a course. Not adding extra time, but just replacing what's not so good with something which is sure to be good. Now let's look at the teacher's jobs. What's the number 1 job of the teacher? Most people would probably say, teach. That's why the teacher is called a teacher. But I think that's wrong. I think the most important job of the teacher is to plan. And it doesn't really mean writing a detailed lesson plan. It means planning to make sure that we are covering those 4 strands which are mentioned in Table 1. In column 3. For me, that's one of the most, well, it's the most important job of the teacher. To make sure that there's fluency development, to make sure there's plenty of input, to make sure there's a chance for output, and to make sure that there's some deliberate language-focused learning and study going on in the course. That's the number 1 job of the teacher. From a vocabulary point of view, another most important job that's in planning is choosing the right vocabulary for the learners to focus on. The second most important job for the teacher is to organize learning in the classroom, to run speed reading courses, to organize group work, to get the extensive reading working well, where each learner's reading a different book, reading quietly, reading at their own level. These people in the language school I went to, when I went to the language school, I sat behind some of the students and I watched them as they read. And so I made a note of the page number of the book they were reading, and then I looked at the time and said, how often do they turn the page? And then by doing that, I roughly counted how many words per page. And I worked out the reading speed that these people were reading at. And for some of the learners, it was around about 180, 190 words a minute, which is a little bit slow, but it's okay. And I worked out that over the period of 1 week, which is 48 weeks, I think, for this language school, where they go once a week for 48 weeks, for that reading speed, for 80 minutes, in 1 year they are reading 500,000 words. Now, 500,000 words sounds a lot. It's not a lot in Cambodia because the money is like 500,000 and everything like that too. But 500,000 words is about the same as 5 novels. If you read 5 novels, each novel's about 100,000 words long. But that's quite good for these students. In 1 year, simply by coming to that class, not doing any homework, but they will read about 500,000 words a year. In a New Zealand school where I've been doing vocabulary size research, in this school, everybody in the school reads for 20 minutes a day. It's a secondary school, and it's native speakers, mainly native speakers, and as soon as the lunch break finishes, for the next 20 minutes, the whole school sits quietly and reads. So they read 20 minutes a day, 5 days a week, for 40 weeks of the year. And they are reading over 500,000 words a year in that time. So extensive reading is very important. You can get large quantities of input through extensive reading. So the teacher organizing these learning opportunities, that's very important. Okay, number 3, train the learners in strategies. Number 4, test the learners. And number 5, teach the learners. And actually get up there and teach something to the learners. If you're spending most of the time in the classroom standing up the front and teaching, you're doing something wrong. Because standing up in front of the class and teaching in a language course should be less than 1/4 of the course time. 3/4 of the course time at least should be the learner doing extensive reading, talking to each other, doing activities where the teacher can rush outside, have a cigarette, or get a bit of marking done, or something like that, where the teacher doesn't have to do anything. Now that's why in table 1.2, I've tried to show you the amount of time in a course that you should be spending on these activities. And so if you find that you are up the front teaching for most of the time for the English course, you're doing something wrong. You're working too hard. My teacher, one of his favorite sayings was, the best teacher is a lazy teacher. A lazy teacher doesn't teach too much, lets the learners do the work. And so what you should be doing as a teacher is to say, how can I make the learners work hard and I don't have to do much? That's the way to succeed. And you live to a very old age, like me. You'll be over 100 years old. Only some days. Okay. So, let's now move to principles. Why do I think that these are the best techniques? Why do I think that extensive reading is the best change that a teacher could add to a course? They really come back to principles. And so what I've tried to do here is to list what I think are the 4 most important principles that teachers should be following in their planning and their organizing. And the first principle is the principle of the 4 strands. And the 4 strands principle simply says, if you want to know if you have a well-balanced language course, you should spend 1/4 of the time, or the learner should spend 1/4 of the time learning from input, meaning focused input. They should spend 1/4 of the time learning from output, that is speaking and writing. They should spend 1/4 of the time studying the language, doing intensive reading, using word cards to learn vocabulary, the teacher teaching them some grammar, if you really want to do that, and that's with substitution tables and dictionary. 1/4 of the time should be spent on that. And 1/4 of the time in the course should be spent on being fluent, becoming fluent. Becoming fluent at speaking, listening, reading, and writing. I'm trying to become fluent in Cambodian. Is that correct? Yeah. I only know one phrase, but I'm very fluent in that phrase. That's my goal. Now, that's a sort of joke, but in a way it's not a joke. Because if your learners go to the first language class, at the end of the first week, they should be fluent. Which means that they only might know a little bit, but what they know, they can use fluently. And it's really important at all stages of a language course that learners have the opportunity to become fluent in the little bits of knowledge that they already have. Fluent in reading, fluent in listening, fluent in speaking, fluent in writing. in very, very limited ways. So, that's the number one principle then. The number one principle is, if you want to know if your course is a good course or not, keep a record of the things which you are doing in your classroom over the next 2 weeks. Write down the techniques you use, roughly how many minutes on each one. And then classify those into the 4 strands of input, output, deliberate learning, and fluency development. And you should roughly have 1/4 of the time in each of those 4 strands. If you don't, then you know what you should do to try and make a balance. The second most important principle is the principle of input. It's really important that the learners get plenty of spoken input through listening and reading input in their courses. Because English is learned as a foreign language, getting input is a very difficult thing. But learners of English as a foreign language are the luckiest learners in the world. And the reason they are the luckiest learners in the world is because there are so many graded readers which are written from the 100 level right to the 8,000 level. And so no matter what the level of your proficiency is as a learner, you can find several books which are at the right level for you. Now this is just such a marvelous resource that it's really terrible that people don't make use of this very important opportunity for input. People who learn English as a second language in the country where English is spoken, they have no choice. They get input all the time. And so, planning for input isn't quite so important. But when English is learned as a foreign language, planning for input is very important. Okay. The third most important principle, and that's the time on task principle. The time on task principle simply says, if you want to become good at doing something, spend time on it. If you want to be good at speaking, then do lots of speaking. If you want to be good at reading, do lots of reading. If you want to be good at listening, do lots of listening. It's a very simple principle. It's a very crude principle because it concentrates on quantity, not on quality. It simply says, get the quantity. But it is a very effective principle. The people who go to the Olympics go to the Olympics because their family was so interested in the sport, their father or mother was a champion in that sport, and they spent time after time after time playing that sport, and the children followed them. The time on task was enormous. They have natural talents too, but the time spent on the task is really important. If you want to get good at doing something, do it a lot. Direction of effort. This is the last principle that I want to talk about. And direction of effort simply means you should focus on the things that you want to learn. It's a very simple principle too, but it really means that you should make sure that learners' attention is directed towards the parts of the task where you really want the learning to occur. Well, why do I give you a handout for this talk? Yeah? Most people have fancy PowerPoints, click a button, something like that. But why give you a handout? Well, let me tell you a story. There were 4 people about my age who used to play golf together. You know golf? Yeah, they do. Okay. I don't play golf, so my swing is terrible. But they used to play golf together. But the problem was that they kept losing the golf balls because they hit the ball and nobody could see where the ball was. Their eyesight wasn't so good. And so they go looking for the golf ball. It cost them a fortune. Now, one of them died. Okay? And then they thought, okay, we need one more person to make up 4. Let's get somebody whose eyesight is really good. Yeah? Because then when we hit the golf ball, they can go, yep, and they know where the ball is. So they look around and they find someone with really, really good eyesight. And so they go out, first guy stands there, and the new person goes, okay? And everyone turns from his head, did you see it? Yep. Where did it go? I don't remember. Now, the terrible thing when I give a talk is that people remember the stories and they don't remember the talk. So the reason I give you a handout is so that your memory no longer has to depend on you, but the memory can depend on the piece of paper. Another principle that my teacher used to follow was the principle he used when he gave lectures. He never let people take notes. He used to say, pencils and paper are the enemies of learning. If you want to forget, write it on a piece of paper. If you want to remember, no pencils, paper, you have to sit there and listen. It's very interesting to do that. You try going to lectures where you don't take notes, but you just listen to what the person says and then try to remember. And the way you process, you find that you have to change. Because you start thinking, is this important or not? Yeah, okay, it's important. Okay, I'll try and remember it. And you do something which helps your memory. At the end of the class, you rush away, make your notes. Okay, you don't have to do that now because everything's here on this piece of paper. At the end of the handout, I've listed a few free resources that you can get from the web. The mid-frequency readers are the books I was telling you about. There's a range program, there's lots of tests, and so you can get most of those things from my website. It's great that teachers come to conferences like this. Even though you might be supported to come to a conference, you have to spend time, and you always have to spend some kind of money to come to a conference. So I think it's really important, I'm really impressed that so many people spend this time and money when they could be having a holiday to come to a conference to improve their professional skill. So I thank you and salute you.